Today we're going to be talking about the 2023 Science of Logic Philosophy Portal Conference. And it occurred to me that I had not yet recorded a reflection on it. It was a tremendous conference. I enjoyed every minute of it. And we have another conference at Philosophy Portal coming up this weekend on Lacan, which will be a blast. And I'm really looking forward to all of the content and material that people will be exploring. I enjoyed Cadell's intro to the conference on really describing the stakes, how we can see in Hegel a movement from Aristotle, Spinoza, to a new kind of logic, an updated logic. And the phrase, this kind of idea of moving from metaphysics based on substance to positive contradiction, I think that is extremely important. And I think Cadell did a really good job of outlining throughout the entire course, he did a great job outlining what that means. I also really like the idea of the philosophical science takes responsibility for the inner movement of thought. I think that's quite powerful. I don't think we take enough responsibility for the inner movement of our thought. And I liked how Cadell put an emphasis on Marx. I love Marx, and I really enjoyed his presentation on the question of Hegel as a presuppositionalist philosophy, and that we really have to take that reading seriously if we're going to take Hegel seriously. And how is that possible, though? How is it possible to have a philosophy that doesn't presuppose anything at all? And I like the way that there's an emphasis on the movement of thought. Like, obviously, we see in Descartes an idea of doubting everything to get to a presuppositionless philosophy. But there are inadequacies to that. And what we see in Marx is an argument which I completely agree with. I've talked about intersuppositional thinking. And what we see in Hegel is an idea that instead of, we follow the movement of thought. It's more phenomenological than it is imposing categories. Like, a thing is what arises in its dialectical movement, not what fits into a category. And so the categories kind of arise from experience, but then they're immediately let go because they're always historically situated. An acorn is an acorn until it becomes a tree, and then you let the category go. Well, that's really important, because what a thing is then arises with its development in movement. So there's something about our relation to the thing, our observation of the thing, its movement through history that really has to be taken very seriously. Dimitri's work of love, he's written a tremendous work on this. I believe you can find it on his Substack as well. I think he has a video at his YouTube on this idea of love is the most immense contradiction, he quotes Hegel on. And the key is that there's something about love that is a commitment in working through the negativity and finding a kind of unity in that negativity. There's a negation of the negation, if you will. You're negated by otherness, but then in love you negate that negation, not because you become some sort of blob, but it's more like a dance, two, but they're one in the dance. And I really like his emphasis on philosophy, not as love, but as the work of love. I think it's quite powerful. And I think that's true. I think there's something about philosophy and love that is strongly connected. I really like the idea of the work of love as the emphasis, and without philosophy, we don't do the work of love. Really liked this argument and thought he got into a lot. I love Jason. He did such a tremendous job on the cover of Abyssal Arrows, and he have a great presentation on forgetting the forgetting. And I really liked in this presentation the idea that if we don't forget that we forgot, we start to lose a certain openness to the future. And I should note in Dimitri's presentation, and this also came out with his talk with Dylan Shaw on reconciliation, we really can't have love if we don't have this utter openness to the future, to the unknown. Well, likewise, we have to forget that we forgot in a way to be kind of fully open to otherness, to the unknown. Otherwise, there could be a moralization of that act of forgetting, or we're not actually holding on to anything, we're just forgetting, right? So there's this kind of double move that has to occur where we're not conscious of the fact that we forgot, but we're just completely losing ourselves in what's going on. And I like how he tied this to a notion of perfecting I think it's true that there's a kind of arrogance if you say that we can't be perfect, because how do you know? He was saying in the questions and answers. And I agree. I think there's something humble about putting ourselves to the work of love, to the work of perfecting ourselves. So I thought Jake had a great presentation as well. Barris gave a lovely presentation emphasizing concept as life, of life. The concept is an important category in Hegel. And I think in the concept, there's this idea that there's a kind of split in thought. So Barris also alludes to the from the philosophy of right, the actual is the rational and the rational is the actual. Well, the rational entails a kind of split, and life entails a split. And I think if we think of the concept as the split like life, then we start to see that emergence, because it's precisely the break that makes possible, say, the birth. Barris gave a presentation on the mother and on the previous conference, and it's only because the child can be split from the mother that life is possible. So we need to see the split in the concept, in the rational, if you will, as similar to the split of life itself, and I think that was really well argued. Raza gave a great presentation incorporating a lot of Alex Ebert's work, which was really great. I liked how we talked about beatboxing, the extimacy. And I think this kind of gets at the movement itself, which also has a kind of stagnancy at the same time, or a sort of consistency, which seems to be a contradiction until we think of something like beatboxing. Or an example I've made that Raza was kind to reference was the hip-hop cipher. In the cipher, you have a closed circle, a kind of true infinity, and yet it's indeterminate. So you have this mixture between the determinate and the indeterminate that you see in the cipher, and I think Raza is quite wise to suggest this sort of concept, this sort of schema is what we need to think community today, and if we don't, we're going to be in trouble. And I agree with Cadell that what we see online is kind of networks of networks, more rhizomatic. So I think that was really good. And Isaiah did a wonderful presentation on Neon Genesis Evangelion, which is a classic. I really agree that thinking Evangelion with psychoanalysis and Lacan and Hegel is spot on. I would say that basically the third impact in that anime reflects a inability to come to terms with psychoanalysis, a denial of it. And I like how he compared the two endings, because I do think the original ending is more where Shinji accepts being human, psychoanalysis accepts lack, where in the end of Evangelion he does not, until arguably the end when he comes around, assuming it's not too late, because they're, disgusting, as, is said at the very end famously. But this was a great presentation. I really like how we broke down the show. James Wisdom gave a great presentation on Nothing Matters. I really liked how he emphasized the veil, and the veil is the thing itself, in that the nothing of which we project in a way behind appearances, behind everything as a veil, is what makes them a veil, which gives them their being. But the thing in of itself, to quote Zizek, as Mr. Wisdom does, every appearance implies, or rather creates, its own in itself. It conceals and indicates a dimension of substantial reality behind its veil, and for Hegel, we pass from substance to subject when we realize that there is nothing behind the veil. This is very important, because the reason why we can pass from subject to substance, from substance to subject, is because we realize the thing in of itself that we believe constitutes substance is actually a result of a certain projection of ourselves onto things. That means really substance as a concept is very much like the noumenon for Hegel, which is for us. We think substance is for us. It's a thing for the subject. To think of itself, to go about reality, to make reality conceptual, comprehensible, and so on and so forth. And so if everything is a veil, the word veil only makes sense if there's a subject of whom is being veiled. And so we have to pass from substance to subject as the centrality of our concern. Next we have Quinn, and I always appreciate his thinking. Hegel, Eastern thought, Nishanti, religion and nothingness. I really appreciate what Quinn always brings to the table, and his presentation, The Living Contradiction, was outstanding. I really like the phrase that he brought out in it as well, where there's annihilation but not elimination. And I think that does link together with kind of the shine in Hegel, this kind of shining forth, which seems to be what this, Thomas Wynne has talked about, letting, this annihilation, this clearing, all of that seems to be about letting forth some kind of shine, which seems like an elimination, but it is not. And I think Quinn did a good job of bringing that out. Cadell's presentation on concept of being, where he really made a wonderful example of philosophy portal. I really always appreciate those kind of personal examples that Hegel brings, that Cadell brings into his presentations. And the phrase patience of the concept, I think, is really powerful. And I think that's really, really important and something we have to think. And I think his emphasis on how we have to somehow be pro-natal and pro-tech today, and we really haven't figured out how to do that. This problem cannot be overemphasized. I think it's really a big deal. And I really thought Cadell in this presentation brought to the forefront some of the major problems and issues that the liminal web has to think, which then I think went well with David of Underground Theory, his presentation. And I appreciate the distinction between the scene and intellectual milieu. And I'm afraid I've mistaken this. I've been using the term scene incorrectly. But I really like this kind of distinction on what is an intellectual milieu versus a scene, and how we don't want to just be a scene kid. And I really like that point when you have a real kind of milieu, a real alternative, then everyone at the concert is also in their own band. They're not just at the concert to watch, but they're also doing their own thing. And I think that starts to describe kind of this rhizomic character of the liminal web today. So I really like, and I really like this, and I guess I was going to say, if you're not in your own band while you're watching another band, then you're notably susceptible to capture. And I think that's something that David was suggesting here, that we really need to think. And so we need to be in a milieu, otherwise we're going to be just in an affinity group and we're going to be susceptible to capture, and it's not going to be something long-term. And I think that's kind of a big thing that David is asking, what are the conditions of possibility that make a milieu possible? I think that's something we really have to think, and I think it's really important. Alex Ebert's presentation on lack and excess, which is freak theory, brings to mind his work on freak theory. I think Ebert's work on this is really the best description I know of, and he talks about in his paper in Enter the Alien, of kind of the fundamental thinking that's going on in Hegel, notably at the end of the Doctrine on Being. And I think this idea that at a certain point excess becomes lack, there's a certain threshold that has to be passed. I think this really does get at what Hegel is talking about in his metaphysics. And I think that Mr. Ebert's work on this subject is extremely helpful. And I really suggest this presentation as well as any of his other presentations on freak theory. I think it's very, very powerful. Bruce Alderman is a beautiful man. I love his work, his emphasis on education. I've had the pleasure of speaking with him at Voicecraft. I think where he talks about he loves the slippery middles. I really liked, with kind of after Latour, this emphasis on the words in philosophy like on or into or between, these kind of small middle words we often overlook that sort of condition the character and quality of relating. I think that really came out in his presentation. I like that. I like the phrase wild knot. That was a great phrase. The wonderful Chetan, I always love Chetan, and his thinking of Wittgenstein and Hegel together, I think, really opens a lot of horizons of thought that we need to take seriously. I also like this kind of idea that you find yourself falling back into philosophy, even if you're not trying to, simply because you run into obstacles, whether it be in economics, anthropology, teaching, it doesn't matter. You just find yourself at obstacles that are philosophical in character. And so you just fall back into philosophy, not because you wake up one day and say, I want to do philosophy. You just keep falling back into it. You can't avoid it. And I think that's exactly right. And I like also this question he rises to, what is the nature of authority? Even in Zizek going to Hegel, or us going to Hegel, there's this kind of looking for authority. And what does that mean? What is the character of learning and thinking that seeks an authority? What does that gesture mean? Is it okay? Is it good? Is it bad? It's an interesting thing. And how can we also, I do think it's interesting in Wittgenstein how he kind of suggests learning is not really categorical. It's not really like you learn because like Wittgenstein critiques Augustine, for example, where Augustine I learned because my parents pointed at things and told me what they are. In Wittgenstein's, that is not what happened. Wittgenstein's that's not what happened at all. It's much more of a certain gathering up of experience, which, it almost seems, to go back to Max's presentation, seems presuppositionless. We just kind of follow the movement of experience and learn from there. So maybe, maybe Wittgenstein's theory of language, his theory of learning, at least, takes us back to Hegel. And I like how Chiton also suggests, if for Wittgenstein, if words have actually refer to things, then they must have something to do with those things. And Chiton asks if it's a not relation, like the relation that the word cat has to the thing cat is a non-relation, which is strange, but a non-relation might be a bit more Hegelian and help us think that together. A necessary non-relation. I really like that. Joe had a fascinating presentation on the history and emergence of logic historically. I really found this quite interesting. We went through kind of where logic emerged in history, how it started, what we can think for it. He went through the pre-Socratics, Aristotle, Wolfram, computer science. I really found this a very informative presentation. I appreciated. GHOTC did a lovely presentation on thinking quality and quantity debate. I really, and how this has implications for education. We have to somehow kind of keep together equality, quality, and quantity. There's something about neoliberalism that makes these hard to keep together. And really, what if we took Hegel seriously, how would that change? How would that change education? I love she had this phrase, Hegel becomes imp in understanding this shift, like a kind of an imp in this shift, like he's kind of there forcing us along. And I really like how she presents that in her presentation. Peter Robinson gave a beautiful presentation, Stranger in a Strange Land, and I always enjoy speaking with Peter. And I like this emphasis really kind of on this idea that we don't really understand ourselves without thinkers like Hegel and Lacan. He comes from a background of science, really studying science, and it was lovely to hear his story and his own personal coming to appreciate the work of someone like a Hegel, and how we have to acknowledge lack and think about lack. I really like his equation, Q equals B, where the ground of being is question. It's open-ended. I think there's something very profound about that. I mean, if the ground of being is always a question, I think that functions a kind of self-defense. I think that can help keep us more engaged in drive, keep us going. So there's something really profound about this idea of having the ground of being be a question. There's some in it. It made me think of James Wisdom when he talked about the thing being the veil. It's like the ground of being as a veil would be the ground of being as a question. That our very asking creates the answer that's not there, and yet the structure of a question that doesn't have an answer, like a real question that doesn't have an answer, is precisely the description of something that can be a source of drive and desire. And if the subject is substance, then the way that the substance is changed by being toward a question without an answer that's a real question would be the absolute. Like that would be the absolute. I think Peter helps us see all that. Next, Timothy Breese. I really appreciate his work on organizations and community, and how he was talking about the blind spots of organizations and communities. I think it was pretty profound. I really like his emphasis on recognizing ourselves more than trying to defeat capitalism, that internal negation, sublation. So Timothy's presentation, and I think presentations like this on community are a big deal. As Dave did, and then Lindbergh later on, and Cadell, I think it's really important. Philip, I love Philip, and I really liked his appreciation. I really liked how he started off talking about Hegel's indifference, where he would see things that were beautiful and say, it is, and how there's a superpower in difference. And this makes me think, again, of Max's presentations, because if we can be indifferent to change, then perhaps we can catch a glimmer of the shine of what's underneath the change. If we're indifferent to things, then we're not so susceptible to applying categories and presuppositions. So maybe we can get a glimpse of the unfolding of things. I also like how we talked about Cain and Abel, and I appreciated the emphasis on grace and forgiveness, and I agree with him. Yeah, and I think we see in the science of logic kind of the indifference that Hegel speaks about as being sort of the absolute, kind of an indifference of which requires the absolute, and that indifference is what allows a annihilation or clearing or openness to the unfolding of being. So I think Philip's presentation aligns with that. Jorge's Rivera, I love him. And I think his thinking really shows how the creative act is kind of extraordinarily useful for understanding Hegel. The process, he has a great film. Michelle had a great talk with him. He's a great man. And I think his work helps us see how the creative act really does help us understand Hegel. Shahil, working through contradiction. I really like the story he told of the tiger and the woman. I also really like this point that Hegel helps us see that what we think is an opposition is actually a contradiction that we are part of, and once we see it as a contradiction, we can see it as something creative. And if it's creative, then things can change. That can be a good thing, and so opposition can become contradiction, which can become creative. And I also like this idea on dreams as work of art, where we talked about Jung, so that was very interesting. Peter Lindbergh did a fascinating presentation on the Wisdom Commons. He does he done work at the Stoa, and he's doing on a Substack Less Foolish. I like what he's talking about. And I especially appreciate some of his Substacks on philosophy as self-defense. That seems really important. And there is, I think, in this presentation, the emphasis on the culture wars and how we need to realize that the culture wars are still with us. I think that's incredibly important. I think the culture wars, the moral reels, as I've called them, they are arguably, in my opinion, the greatest threat to the liminal web. And so I appreciate what he had to say on that. Thomas Wynne is magnificent, and the inversion of how he reads Hegel and Heidegger together, I think, is very important. I think that movement in Hegel, in the negation in Hegel and the annihilation of Heidegger have a lot of overlap. And I think Heidegger can, as Wynne brings out, can help us think this presupposition-less philosophy that Hegel is putting forth, this indifference, and how that allows being to shine forth. So I think Wynne does an incredible job of helping us see Heidegger and Hegel together in this presentation. I gave a presentation on analysis communitas that's trying to bring Leibniz and Hegel together. My reading of Leibniz is completely indebted to Anthony Morley, who's an incredible Leibniz scholar. Highly suggest him. And I tried to bring this together with the question of community and the shock of difference and so on and so forth. Dr. Thomas Hammerich in Induction, Deduction, and Abduction really helps us see Hegel's thinking in light with computer science. And I think the category of abduction is really important, and really what Hegel leads us to, which I do think is the situational reasoning that I think Leibniz also aligns with. So Dr. Hammerich is always a delight. Sostat Hughes on mysticism to metaphysics. I think he helps us. He did a wonderful talk public talk as well with Cadell on thinking psychedelics and metaphysics together, and he uses Hegel for that project. I think he was taught under Holgate. And I think he does fascinating work. And indeed, there's something about the psychedelic experience where if we properly annihilate and clear ourselves, there's some sort of openness to the shine of being that seems to have that psychedelic quality to it. Lastly, Peter Rollins gave a wonderful discussion and lecture on pyrotheology, on theology. That is also trying to, you could almost say on the term pyro, the church as burning. What would it mean to have a burning church? So burning with the Spirit, but also burning down. And there's something about, it is only in the burning church, the church that is burning down, that the Spirit is fully alive. So the church of the contradiction. I like also where he talks about Hegel as the Aquinas of our present moment. I think that's very good. And Peter Rollins also gave a wonderful talk at Philosophy Portal, the YouTube channel, Cadell's YouTube channel, about these topics. And I always enjoy hearing from Peter Rollins. And again, it was a pleasure to be part of the Hegel conference. The Lacan conference is this Saturday, which is going to be February the 24th, and it will also be Sunday the 25th. And I really appreciated all the presentations, and it was a delight to be part. For more from Philosophy Portal, please visit philosophyportal.online, and you can check out Cadell's Substack, YouTube, so on and so forth. And thank you so much for your time.